Okay, it's about 11. I think we're going to start today. I am going to start, and I don't know whether some of you are home, but there are some of you here, and it's wonderful to see you, but I'm going to start with a little bit of an apology. I returned to America yesterday, and this morning my computer briefly turned on and then went black. So the slides that I had prepared, the computer's dead. The slides that I had prepared are on that computer. I didn't have a chance to email them as I would normally do this morning. So there is no slideshow today because there was no time for me to reproduce these slides. So I'm going to ask for some help, and I'm going to ask for volunteers to help. I'm going to ask for people to come up, and Erwin, I'm going to ask you especially to help and to come up and read to the microphone, to maybe be here with me and read to the microphone. And I promise you that the slides will be made up, that we will somehow either recover them or I will reconstruct them, and they will be back, and we will somehow manage this. And I appreciate the help that James has offered me earlier today, and everybody's trying to figure this out as we go. These things happen, and I wish refuah shlema to my computer. And if my computer doesn't recover, then it's a computer, and we will deal with it. We will find another solution. But so in the meantime, I am going to ask us to use our books. Would you like a book?
Here, would you like? Thank you so much. Of course. Would anybody else?
Okay, and we will start, and it's really wonderful. It's really wonderful to see you. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to see you and to be able to learn a little bit together and to come back and do this. And you may be surprised or perhaps worse, disappointed that we are going to launch upon a study of the Scroll of Esther as we approach Passover. And you may think, Rabbi Cohen, what have you done? You have mistimed this. Why are we studying the Scroll of Esther come Passover? What's the big idea? What's happening here? Purim is past. We're preparing for Passover. I don't know how many of you are preparing, but some of us are already thinking about matzah balls and all the rest of it. Yes, there we go. So why Purim now? Well, let me offer a very brief introduction to that. The Purim story is, of course, anchored in the Scroll of Esther, which we do celebrate in the middle of the month of Adar, and we celebrate it in the middle of the month of Adar because the very last chapter of the book of the Scroll of Esther indicates that this is the time we ought to celebrate the holiday of Purim. In fact, it is an edict in chapter 10 of the Scroll of Esther that is sent by Queen Esther to the whole of the Jewish population, indicating in that scroll that this is the time wherein the holiday should be celebrated. However, the holiday of Purim is the holiday that culminates, that is the culmination of a very long story, a story that starts out with the deposition, the deposing of Queen Vashti from the palace of Ahasuerus, and the arrival of Esther into the palace in the context of some kind of a contest that the rabbis time on the month of Tevet, the meeting of Esther and Ahasuerus, according to the rabbis, chapter 2 of Tractate Megillah in the Babylonian Talmud, occurs in the month of Tevet, which basically corresponds to January. December, January, maybe early February. The month of January is the month wherein Esther meets King Ahasuerus, the year after Vashti is deposed. It is in the following month of Adar, according to our Scroll of Esther, the following month of Adar, that the Pur of Haman, that little ritual of Haman, setting the date for the destruction of the Jews, occurs. But the redemption of the Jews, the actual struggle in the context of which the Jews prevail over their enemies, occurs on Passover. The actual story of Purim occurs on Passover. So when you think about it, Purim is actually a 15-month saga from the previous January to the following April. Right? And it actually ends in the month of Nisan, the month we're in now. The beginning of the month of Nisan was yesterday. So the month of Nisan, and the redemption of Purim occurs on Passover. So I just want you to know we haven't mistimed. We're okay. We're in good time, and it's a good time for us to learn about the holiday of Purim and the Scroll of Esther, because the actual story, publicly, the public story, not what happened in the palace and what happened behind closed doors, according to the Scroll of Esther, actually occurs in the month of Nisan, in the middle of the month of Nisan, and it is a liberation and a redemption that is very much, as we will see, a parallel redemption to the redemption of Passover. So Purim and Passover are parallel holidays, and they're created to be celebrated as parallel holidays, right? A few words about the Scroll of Esther before we start. According to a number of places in rabbinic literature, the Scroll of Esther, or the Book of Esther, is the last to be incorporated into the Hebrew Bible. The last to be canonized. It is quite clear to us that the Scroll of Esther is one of the last to be composed. It is among the last batch of biblical books that are composed. We know this for a number of reasons. First of all, we know this because of the names that are mentioned. The names that are mentioned refer to characters, historical characters, that live after the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries before the Common Era. The last ones really live in the 5th century before the Common Era, which means it had to be written afterwards, first of all. So we already know that it's post-5th century before the Common Era. Further, the Hebrew of the Scroll of Esther is relatively modern. We will see certain elements of it already today and then moving forward. We will see how the Hebrew, there are words in Hebrew and citations in Hebrew and phrases in Hebrew that occur nowhere else, that occur in the Scroll of Esther, which are later Hebrew. In fact, Esther is considered an example of a text that is between biblical Hebrew and rabbinic Hebrew. And so we know from the Hebrew that it is a later text. And we also know that there are variants of the Scroll of Esther. In other words, Esther is not this one unique book, as are many others in the Hebrew Bible. Many books in the Hebrew Bible are Hebrew books that then have various translations, various commentaries, and so on and so forth. Esther actually has variants, including, most importantly, Greek variants. 2 Greek variants. One that we think of as an older variant, and one that perhaps is an alteration of that older variant. In other words, Esther is produced in both Hebrew and Greek. Now, most scholars believe that the earlier text is the Hebrew text, and that the Greek text was a translation and enlargement of that Hebrew text, but we don't know. We do not know. What are the salient and most interesting elements that I must speak to you about with regard to Esther before we even start speaking, before we start saying anything? First of all, the Hebrew Scroll of Esther, the Hebrew Scroll of Esther, is unlike any of the scrolls we looked at thus far, unlike any of them, right? Because the other scrolls that we have looked at thus far are all somehow anchored in the land of Israel. The Song of Songs, remember the Song of Songs and the imagery from the land of Israel and the references to the vines and the hills of Judah and Mount Hermon and all, everything is anchored in the land of Israel. Remember? Yeah? The story of Ruth, the family of Ruth coming from Judah, from Bethlehem, moving to Moab, and then moving back to Judah, to Bethlehem. Yet again, the story is anchored in that return, the return to the land of Israel. Lamentations about Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem. Yes, all anchored in the land of Israel. And Kohelet Ecclesiastes, right? Remember what we looked at? Being king of Jerusalem, the whole thing starts. I, Ecclesiastes, I, Kohelet, was king over Jerusalem. Nothing about the land of Israel, nothing about Jerusalem. Everything occurs outside the country. That's number one. It is a completely diaspora text. Right? There is nothing like it in the Hebrew Bible in the context of our corpus of the five scrolls. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. That's number one. First of all, we're dealing with a diaspora text, which is unique among the corpus of the five scrolls. Number two, the Hebrew version, unlike the Greek, the Hebrew version of the Scroll of Esther, which we read to this day, that's incorporated into our Hebrew Bible, does not contain a single, not one, mention or reference to God. Not one. No prayer, no reference to God, no thank God, please God, nothing. Not one single reference to God in a biblical text. I knew you'd like this, Mel. Right? It's astounding. It really is remarkable. Not a single reference to God. In the Greek version, there are references to God. But we're going to talk about that another day. Right? Then there is a third element I must mention to you. The Scroll of Esther is a political book. It's political. The story is about government. The story is about politics. The story is about minority-majority relations of those Jews living in the diaspora in the context of a non-Jewish majority, led by a non-Jewish government, and the threats that they must face as such people who live under these kinds of circumstances. Right? This is what we're talking about in the context of the Scroll of Esther. And so the Scroll of Esther truly stands out. Truly stands out. Okay? The rabbis then, there are rabbis who regret the text being canonized, who say that the text should not have been canonized. There are rabbis who go as far as to say that the Scroll of Esther creates impurity for anyone who touches it. Right? In other words, we don't even want to read it, right? But the Scroll of Esther becomes so significant that there is no way to decanonize it or to remove it from the canon. It becomes one of the most significant books of the Hebrew Bible. In fact, it has a greater impact in the non-Jewish world politically than the overwhelming majority of other books of the Hebrew Bible. It becomes a book that is deeply studied and deeply examined. And I don't know if you recall this, but toward the end of my very first year here at the temple, I taught some of the Scroll of Esther, and I taught some of the Protestant Catholic debates that arose in Europe, especially during the 17th and 18th century, and the use of the Scroll of Esther in describing them. For those of you who may recall, the Scroll of Esther was actually cited by a number of abolitionist ministers who lobbied Abraham Lincoln to end slavery in America. The Scroll of Esther has been used politically in a whole number of different contexts and is one of the most cited books of the Hebrew Bible, and especially used in the context of non-Jewish politics. So, and some of this one day maybe we will go back to. Most of this we will not be able to cover this time round. We're really going to look into the Scroll of Esther and study the Scroll of Esther. So the Scroll of Esther, I will say one last thing in conclusion before we truly start. The Scroll of Esther was written by very few hands and certainly redacted by one or two hands. It was redacted centrally, which means that it's a perfect book. In terms of its redaction, between the story of Ruth, which is magnificently redacted, and the story of Esther, which is longer, significantly longer, and which is also beautifully redacted, Esther is absolutely perfect. There is a beginning, there is a crisis, there is a middle, a turning point. 2/3 of the way through the book, there is the climax, and following that, there is a conclusion. It's perfect. Everything is constructed perfectly. Introduction and context, crisis, turning point, climax, and resolution. One can create an outline of the book of Esther, of the Scroll of Esther, seeing how perfectly it is written, how coherent it is in terms of its language, and how it engages in a study on a number of levels of the crisis and of the resolution of the crisis that are described in the Scroll of Esther. No biblical book is as well redacted as the book of Esther. Remarkable. Just a masterpiece of redaction. Yes?
I just wondered if you have any thoughts about why God is not resting, because it's clearly about community that wouldn't exist without believing God.
So the question is, why is God not mentioned in the Scroll of Esther? I think there are two questions within that question, and I'm going to respond to neither. And I'm going to respond to neither because I don't have the time. It's an excellent question, and I'm going to try to say this briefly. The first question is, why is God not included in the text? In other words, why is the text composed in a way that gives God no credit, or that gives God no mention in the context of this text? That's question number one. And the answer to that is very complicated. And part of it, only a small part of it that I will say now because I cannot answer it fully. But part of the answer is that Esther, to begin with, is not a religious text. Esther is a political text. It's a political drama. It reads like a Greek drama. But it's a political drama, not a religious one. And it is written as a political drama rather than a religious one, but that's only a small part of the response that we will maybe come to in future sessions, right? We will add to that in future sessions. And then there's a second question that's a really interesting question. The Greek version does contain God. About a dozen references to God, and dreams and prayers, a whole number of other things that occur there. The Greek version is in many ways more biblical than the Hebrew version. Why was not the biblical version, if you like the Greek version, the more biblical version, included in the canon? Why didn't they translate this into Hebrew and include this in the biblical canon rather than the Hebrew version of Esther? Right? In other words, why pick the version that includes no mention of God to include in the biblical canon? Right? And I think that the answer to that question, though, again, that is debated, and there's a real, it's really interesting to think about these things. I think that they understood the Hebrew version of Esther that was included in the canon to be the authentic one. And that the notion of this being a Hebrew text corresponded to what was needed to be included in the biblical canon. In other words, everything in the biblical canon that is included is written. The bulk of what is included in the Hebrew Bible is written in what languages? In two languages, Hebrew and Aramaic, right? And mostly Hebrew. And this last book is written in Hebrew, and they would take the Hebrew version. They did not, I think, want to go through an exercise of translation from an original Greek into the Hebrew for this to be incorporated into the canon. Right? But it's an excellent question. And it renders the Scroll of Esther all the more interesting and in many ways all the more complicated. Right? So, there are very few books in the Hebrew Bible that I don't like. And the Scroll of Esther is not one of them. But there are things in the Scroll of Esther that I don't like. There are things in other Hebrew biblical books that I don't like. And sometimes we talk about them and we study them. And the idea is to look at everything. And today we're going to look at some of the passages that are not my favorite passages, for reasons that I think are going to become apparent. Nevertheless, they're fascinating, they're interesting, and they are part of the story. And they are part of the book, they're part of the scroll, and it is incumbent upon us to learn them and to understand them. So we started out explaining that this really is a political drama. Let's start from that premise and really look at the Scroll of Esther as a political drama. I would normally have my slides up and we would do this with my slides, but I would like to start out without the slides, and I'd like to start out beyond the Scroll of Esther in a piece of writing that was produced by the Roman historian of the first to the very, very early 2nd century to the Common Era, Tacitus, and to start with the words of Tacitus about the Jews, about the Judeans, about the Hebrews. Let's start from that. So I'm going to ask you, Erwin, I've just volunteered you to help me out, and to take a mic, if that's okay, and to read paragraphs 4 and 5 here.
Four, in order to secure the allegiance of his people in the future, Moses prescribed for them a novel religion quite different from those of the rest of mankind. Among the Jews, all things are profane that we hold sacred. On the other hand, they regard as permissible what seems to us immoral. In the innermost part of the temple, they consecrated an image of the animal which had delivered them from their wandering and thirst, choosing a ram as beast of sacrifice to demonstrate, so it seems, their contempt for Haman. The bull is also offered up because the Egyptians worship it as Apsis. They avoid eating pork in memory of their tribulations, as they themselves were once infected with the disease to which this creature is subject. They still fast frequently as an admission of the hunger they once endured so long, and to symbolize their hurried meal, the bread eaten by the Jews is unleavened. We are told that the seventh day was set aside for rest because this marked the end of their toils. In course of time, the seductions of idleness made them devote every seventh year to indolence as well. Others say that this is a mark of respect to Saturn, either because they owe the basic principles of their religion to the Idae, who, we are told, were expelled in the company of Saturn and became the founders of the Jewish race, or because, among the 7 stars that rule mankind, the one that describes the highest orbit and exerts the greatest influence is Saturn. A further argument is that most of the heavenly bodies complete their path and revolutions in multiples of 7. Keep going.
Yeah.
5. Whatever their origin, these observances are sanctioned by their antiquity. The other practices of the Jews are sinister and revolting, and have entrenched themselves by their very wickedness. Wretches of the most abandoned kind, who had no use for the religion of their fathers, took to contributing dues and free will offerings to swell the Jewish exchequer. And other reasons for their increasing wealth may be found in their stubborn loyalty and ready benevolence toward brother Jews. But the rest of the world they confront with the hatred reserved for enemies. They will not feed or intermarry with Gentiles. Though a most lascivious people, the Jews avoid sexual intercourse with women of alien race. Among themselves, nothing is barred. They have introduced the practice of circumcision to show that they are different from others. Proselytes to Jewry adopt the same practices, and the very first lesson they learn is to despise the gods, shed all feelings of patriotism, and consider parents, children, and brothers as readily expendable. However, the Jews see to it that their numbers increase. It's a deadly sin to kill an unwanted child. And they think that eternal life is granted to those who die in battle or execution. Hence, their eagerness to have children and their contempt for death. Rather than cremate their dead, they prefer to bury them in imitation of the Egyptian fashion, and they have the same concern and beliefs about the world below. But their conception of heavenly things is quite different. The Egyptians worship a variety of animals and half-humans, half-bestial forms, whereas the Jewish religion is purely spiritual monotheism. They hold it to be impious to make idols of perishable materials in the likeness of man. For them, the Most High and Eternal cannot be portrayed by human hands and will never pass away. For this reason, they erect no images in their cities, still less in their temples. Their kings are not so flattered, the Roman emperors not so honored. However, their priests used to perform their chants to the flute and drums, crowned with ivy, and a golden vine was discovered in the temple. And this has led some to imagine that the god thus worshipped was Prince Liber, the conqueror of the East. But the two cults are diametrically opposed. Liber was found a festive and happy cult. The Jewish belief is paradoxical and degraded.
Yeah, Tacitus on the Jews. This is taken out. This is a translation of Tacitus' Histories, the Histories by Tacitus. It's chapter 2. It's the second big section. And these are the Jews, the section on the Jews is in paragraphs 2 to 5. You can even find it online. And what we read was paragraphs 4 and 5, right? Now, you have an idea of how the Romans viewed the Jews in the 1st and 2nd centuries to the Common Era, right? And this comes from somewhere. The Jews have a reputation, right? We have a sense of how the Greeks viewed the Jews. We have a sense of how the Romans view the Jews. Tacitus is the Roman historian, so I felt it was important to bring this in. But what is Tacitus saying? Tacitus is saying, these are a different people. They do not worship idols. They do not worship our gods. They do not eat what we eat. They stick to themselves. They hate everyone else, right? They are willing to die for the sake of their own beliefs and their own rituals and practices, right? They believe that those who are executed or who die because of their faith somehow get to heaven. They are working on increasing their numbers, yes, but they're pretty awful. And we don't like them. And worse, remember what we read here towards the conclusion of paragraph 5. Kings are not deeply respected by them, nor is the Roman emperor. Right? Yes? Yes, Ellen.
I have read somewhere that the Romans respected ancient religion and did not persecute Jews. This is maybe prior to Tacitus?
Well, the Romans, you read that the Romans, I'm going to repeat this so that people out there, can hear us. The Romans, you say, respected ancient religions and did not persecute the Jews, right? Well, both the Greeks and the Romans did respect most ancient religions as long as there was a willingness to integrate and to come in and to join in the greater polity, which was either Greek or Seleucid or Roman, right? Which was where the Jews, the Judeans, the proto-Jews, got into trouble, right? With the Seleucids, as we know from the story of Hanukkah and the Maccabees, and later on with the Romans. The Romans had trouble with the Judeans. They rebelled more than once. They caused lots of problems. And the Romans had their thoughts about these Judeans. And they weren't always happy thoughts. Okay? Now, remember this. Remember what we're reading now. This is late 1st century or early 2nd century to the Common Era. Now go to the Scroll of Esther. Now go to the Scroll of Esther and go to chapter 3. Turn to chapter 3 and let's take a look at the page number. I want to make sure we have a page number for chapter 3. 1460, page 1460, chapter 3, right? Okay, and let's read Haman, what Haman has to say in verses 8, 9. Erwin, would you please use the microphone to...
Haman then said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. And it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. If it please your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the stewards for deposit in the royal treasury."
Okay. What is the accusation that Haman levies, that Haman raises against these Judeans, against this people? What does he say? Number one, they're spread out. They're now exiled. They're spread out among the people. Number two, what does he say? I'm sorry? No, they have their own laws. They have their own practices. Remember this from Tacitus? Yes? They follow their own thing. They have their own laws, right? Now, having their own laws, is that such a terrible thing? No. No, well, then it was. Yeah, maybe then it was, right? Perhaps it was then. Perhaps it was then. Would it be such a terrible thing if I had my own laws, but I also obeyed the laws of the land? Right? Would that be such a... my law is to, I don't know, be a vegetarian. Right? So, I don't eat things that are non-vegetarian. But if I follow the laws of the land, and I'm respectful of the laws of the land, is that such a terrible thing? Perhaps, perhaps not. We don't know. But what is the problem? Is the problem that we have our own laws? The problem is, number three, we do not obey the other laws, and we do not respect other authority. Right? Did you read this in Tacitus? We know this from the Greeks. We know this from the Romans. It already occurs in the Scroll of Esther. What we have here is the beginning of what becomes an anti-Jewish set of tropes. What you're reading here in the Scroll of Esther is perhaps chapter 3, the very first direct expression of what will become an anti-Jewish sentiment with which we will live for 2,500 years. What is the key? This is very important. What is the key to that anti-Jewish sentiment? We are different. We are spread out and remain different. We are different, we follow our own laws, and we disrespect, when push comes to shove, we disrespect the local laws. Right? So, when push comes to shove, our laws come first. Our rules come first. And therefore, we are ungovernable. Therefore, we represent a problem. A threat. A threat. That's right, Helga. A threat, a problem. Now, this is something that's really important for us to point out. This continues through the generations. This becomes the core of what becomes Christian anti-Judaism. Right? And all the efforts to convert and to assimilate the Jews, this is where it comes from. Right? And we have to understand this. We have to see this. We have to see that this is there in Persian language written already under Greek domination. It's a Persian set story, but it wasn't written in Persia, right? The story was probably written in Alexandria in Egypt, right? About the Persians, 100 to 150 years later, when Alexandria, Egypt, was dominated by the Greeks, right? In other words, this is what the Greeks were thinking. But the Greeks, the Romans, and later on, others throughout the world. This is, in brief, in 2 verses, and especially in 1, verse 8 of chapter 3, a summary of the core, the kernel of anti-Judaism. There you have it. Right? What is the solution that Haman proposes? By the way, let me add one more thing to this. As David Daube and a number of other senior scholars have explained and correctly demonstrated, at no place in the Scroll of Esther is this disputed. Nowhere is there a response to this. No one offers a response. It just stays there. The accusation is leveled, it's raised, and it remains. Okay? Yes.
Are you referring specifically to the rules of circumcision and kashrut that makes Jews different?
So there are thank you, Helga. I will repeat the question so that others at home can hear it. Is it about the laws of circumcision or kashrut or Shabbat, for that matter, that render the Judeans, the proto-Jews, different? Is this what it's about? Perhaps that is what it is about. But if it is about the understanding of the divine right of kings, of the fact that King Ahasuerus, like other kings, like Roman emperors, like Greek emperors, govern by divine right. And that the Jews consider, these proto-Jews consider the gods that allow these kings to govern to be idols, to be nothing, to be worthless. What we're dealing with here is not simply Jews who follow the laws of the Sabbath, or who follows the laws of kashrut, or who follow circumcision, but Jews who deny the very foundation of non-Jewish government. Who deny the legitimacy of the kings and emperors because they consider their gods to be idols in other places. Right? In other words, not only people who follow their own laws, but who somehow are skeptical of other legal systems. They don't see them as being valid when push comes to shove. Yes? Now, here is a significant challenge. It's a problem. Yes? Okay, Margie.
Though it's a political, document, as you say, the religion is quite intertwined with the political, right? Because
absolutely,
they're so offended that
yes,
we only believe in one God you can't see.
The religion is completely intertwined in the politics, and this is primarily a political document, right? So now let's go from verse 8 to verse 9 again in chapter 3. What does Haman propose? What does Haman propose as the solution to this problem of the Jews? Destroy them. You're not going to solve this problem. The only way to solve it, you can't fix it. What do? You remove it. Remove them. Get rid of them. Destroy them. Right? And in return for destroying these proto-Jews, these Judeans, you will get a one-time lump sum of 10,000 pounds of silver. Right? We will collect their goods, right? 10,000 pounds of silver as a one-time lump sum payment. Yes? Does that sound familiar? Destroy the Jews once and for all, remove them, get rid of this, right? A final solution, if you like, to the Jewish problem. Just get rid of it. One time, lump sum solution, take everything they own, keep it, and just get rid of them. Once and for all, we will be rid of these Jews. Yes? This is the solution, and this is where the thought of that solution comes from. Now, what is the Scroll of Esther about? The entire Scroll of Esther, the entire story, what is the story about, and why is it composed? As a Jewish response, a Jewish argument, pointing to the inability, to the lack of feasibility of this solution to the Jewish problem. Right? This is the core. We have reached the core of the Scroll of Esther. What is the Scroll of Esther? It's not a response to the political argument about the Jews. It is a response to the proposed solution to that Jewish problem, as it is presented by Haman. And sadly, tragically, horrifically, not for the last time. Okay? Which leads us to chapter 7 of the Scroll of Esther. Let's turn to chapter 7 and to verses 3 and 4 of the Scroll of Esther, and let us start there, right? What page are we on?
1464.
1464, page 1464. Let's go to chapter 7. Now we are in the second banquet that Queen Esther has organized for Ahasuerus and Haman and all the rest of it. This is the second time they gather. And again, Ahasuerus says, now what do you want? What? Look, we've come here. It's the second evening we've come. We've had a lovely meal. Tell me, what is this about, right? And Esther says, and what does she say?
Queen Esther replied, "If your majesty will do me the favor, and if it pleases your majesty, let my life be granted me as my wish, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, massacred, and exterminated. Had we only been sold as bondmen and bondwomen, I would have kept silent, for the adversary is not worthy of the king's trouble."
So the adversary is not worth the king's trouble is a problematic translation. And I will explain why. But what does she say? What does she say? Referencing back to chapter 3 of the Scroll of Esther, what does Esther say? I ask for my life and the life of my people because we have been sold to be killed. Sold by the 10,000 pounds of silver, to be killed, to be destroyed the way Haman, right? Absolutely correct. Yes? All right. Until you reach the end being the adversary, right? Being worthy of the king's trouble, right? The word for adversary, which I didn't have this translation with me as I was preparing this, and as you know, I have my reservations about this translation anyway. But the word for adversary here, the Hebrew word is nezek. Nezek. Nezek is financial harm or financial loss. And nezek becomes financial harm or financial loss in a way that brings about liability. What is Esther's argument? The harm or the loss, the financial harm or the financial loss to the king outweighs the trouble that the king is experiencing with the Jews. In other words, what has Haman done? Haman has offered you 10,000 pounds of silver as a lump sum one time in order to destroy all the Jews, right? Whereas the Jews are an asset. And imagine what you could do. They could become bondsmen and bondswomen, and they could continue working and produce value. They could continue to be taxed. They could continue to be used in order to increase the wealth of the kingdom. But what has Haman done? Haman has taken those Jews, offered you a lump sum for these Jews, is going to destroy these Jews, thereby destroying this asset to the king. In other words, what is Esther's argument to Ahasuerus? It's bad governance. Haman not only wants to kill me, your queen, and my entire people, the Jews, but Haman wants to do this for his own personal edification, because Mordechai wouldn't bow down to him and so on and so forth. He wants to do this for his own personal edification and for his own profit at your expense, the king. You, the king, are going to be harmed through this policy promulgated by Haman. What is Esther's response to Haman? It is good for the king to have Jews in the kingdom because they're an asset. They generate wealth, they can be taxed, they work, right? It's good for the king. It's good for the government. Right? What has Haman done by proposing to kill the Jews? He's harmed the king. He's harmed the government. Yes? Now, the word nezek occurs, by the way, this is a parenthetical comment, nezek, which means harm or loss, which is the appropriate translation to what we've been looking at here, right? Nezek is a modern Hebrew word. It's going to become used by Rabbinic Hebrew. It doesn't occur in other places in the Hebrew Bible. It doesn't occur in the 5 books of Moses. In the Torah, there is no nezek. Right? In other words, it's a modern Hebrew word. I look at the word nezek and I know that this was written in the 4th or after the 4th century before the Common Era. Right? It's a clue. Yes, it's an example. I'm offering that as an example. Right? Okay. Chapter 7, verse 3. Now, what is the solution? Now, what should be done about this? Right? What is the solution to this? Erwin, can you continue reading? Into verse 4.
I read 4.
Yeah, so let's continue reading then, 2 verses down.
Start at 5?
Yeah.
Thereupon, King Ahasuerus demanded of Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who dared to do this?" "The adversary and enemy," replied Esther, "is this evil Haman."
Right, so now, Mi hu ze ve'ezehu, asks King Ahasuerus. Who is this person and what is he who created this policy, right? And she says, oyev, she uses the word oyev, adversary or enemy, ra, evil, right? Haman, right? She uses these words. Who is this now an adversary to? Who is he an enemy to? Who is he an enemy to?
The king.
The king. He's not just an enemy to the Jews, he's an enemy to the king. What's he done here? He's trying to promulgate a policy that will harm the king. He's undermining the king. Yes? You see what happened here? Within no time, 3, 4, and 5, Haman became from an enemy of the Jews to becoming an enemy not just of the Jews, but also an enemy of the king. Now we're going to go to 8 and 9. Yes.
I just want to say one thing, that the Cleveland Museum of Art has a painting that depicts exactly chapter 7 by Jan Steen, the Dutch artist.
And I was going to have it on my slides.
Oh, yeah, it's a
Yes.
great painting.
Yes.
It's in the Dutch gallery. Next
Yes.
time you're there, check it
It's
out.
a wonderful painting. A wonderful painting. Thank you, Margie. I was going to have it on my slides. Yeah.
8.
Yeah.
When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet room, Haman was lying prostrate on the couch on which Esther reclined. "Does he mean," cried the king, "to ravish the queen in my own palace?" No sooner did these words leave the king's lips than Haman's face was covered. Then Harbonah, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "What is more, a stake is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai."
Right. Okay. Now, what happened here? Haman is seen by the king trying to plead for himself, being prostrate on the queen's bed. The queen is lying on the bed, and Haman is trying to plead with her, and half of his body is lying on the bed, right? He's trying to plead effectively for his life, right? What is the king's response to that? What is Ahasuerus's response to that?
Keep going. Impale him on
No, wait a minute. Just what is the king's response to seeing Haman on Esther's bed? He makes the assumption that Haman is going to rape her, or does he really think that Haman is going to rape her? I mean, is this what he says? Right? What is happening here? What is he thinking? Haman is either going to rape her and in that way attack the king's property because she belongs to the king, right? And therefore act in his own self-interest against the king again, or remember that the mindset at the time in antiquity and the way all of this is produced. In other words, it reinforces the view of Haman that Esther just explained a few verses up, or else, what is he going to do? He's going to plead his case, right? And plead his case to Esther, turning Esther over and moving Esther away from supporting her husband, the king, to supporting the interest of Haman. In other words, turn her over. In which case, the king yet again would be betrayed and would be finding himself with a stronger force acting against the king's own interest. In any event, what are we looking at here? A betrayal of the king. A betrayal of the king. What is this about? Is this just about destroying the Jews? No. It's about betraying the king. Okay? So when we say that there is no direct response to chapter 3 of the Scroll of Esther, there is something of a response, and it's in chapter 7. And it starts in verses 3 and 4, and it continues onwards. Right? And of course the response is impale Haman on that 50-cubit high pole or stake that he erected in his own backyard for Mordecai. Yes. Thank you, Deborah. I will repeat the question. Not only am I going to repeat the question, I'm going to expand on it with Deborah's permission. Deborah is asking a serious question. And the question that she's asking is, Haman's issue with the Judeans didn't have to do with their not paying taxes. They didn't have to do with their financial lack of contribution to the king. They had to do, his problem was, with their undermining the entire legal system. The law was that everyone was to bow down to Haman. And everybody was to bow down to Haman because Haman was second only to King Ahasuerus. So by bowing down to Haman, one was expressing respect or dignity toward the king, to whom Haman was second in command, for whom Haman was the deputy. Why? Why? Because King Ahasuerus is king by divine right. Right? That's why. There is a reason Ahasuerus is king. And the reason Ahasuerus is king is by divine right. God said Ahasuerus would be king. God made Ahasuerus king. And then when God makes Ahasuerus king, and Ahasuerus nominates Haman to be second in command, and Haman becomes his deputy, everybody needs to bow down to Haman by way of recognizing Ahasuerus, whose kingship is by divine right. When Mordechai doesn't bow down to Haman, what is the statement that Mordechai is making? It's not, I disrespect you, Haman, personally. I have a problem with you, I disrespect you, I'm not going to bow down to you. No, that's not the problem. What is the problem? The problem is, I don't accept your garbage about the divine right of Ahasuerus. I don't owe you this dignity because I challenge you in your position by virtue of King Ahasuerus placing you in this position and King Ahasuerus being the king by virtue of the divine right of kings. Right? In other words, what is this? It's a constitutional challenge. It's an insurgency. It's a constitutional challenge. Right? This is the point that Haman is making. Now, let's take this question and come back to chapter 7. Right? Did I get the question right? Yes. Right? Okay. Esther is presenting it differently, right? But that's the problem that Haman presents. It's a constitutional issue, right? So now Esther comes in and says, I am your queen. I belong to you, King Ahasuerus, and my allegiance is to you. And what are the implications of Haman's policies? They are harmful to you. In other words, not only does Queen Esther ignore the constitutional challenge that Haman presents in chapter 3, but she says Haman's policies represent a constitutional challenge to you because they're harmful to you. The real risk to your government, she says to the king, is Haman, not the Jews. At the end of the day, in spite of everything, I, as a Jewess, am loyal to you, the king, by pointing this out. In the way, by the way, that Mordechai pointed out the conspiracy to kill the king. protecting the king earlier in the Scroll of Esther. In other words, this is an indication of Mordecai's allegiance to the king, in spite of the fact that his behavior also represents a constitutional challenge to the very right of the king to exist in his position. Now, you see, this is a constitutional text. Wonderful, right? Okay. Does that help? Do we have time for a little bit more? Let's talk about anger. Anger. Let's talk about anger. Okay? Turn to Proverbs, the book of Proverbs, chapter 16. Let's talk about anger for a moment. Where is chapter 16? What page is chapter 16 of the book of Proverbs? Does anyone know? 13:10. Chapter 16. And let's take a look at verses. It's in the middle of the chapter. I'm thinking. I think it's verse 40. Let's start in verse 10. Verse 10. Okay, let's read chapter 16, verse 10.
There is magic on the lips of the king. He cannot err in judgment. Honest scales and balances are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are his work. Wicked deeds are an abomination to kings, for the throne is established by righteousness. Truthful speech wins the favor of kings. They love those who speak honestly. The king's wrath is a messenger of death, but a wise man can appease it. The king's smile means life. His favor is like a rain cloud in spring.
Kings at their best are about righteousness. They're about truth and they're about life, right? At their best. This is what government at its best is about, right? What is the king's wrath about? The king's wrath is a messenger of death, right? Remember? Yes? Good. Yeah, does that offer us a sense? Again, remember, this is out of the wisdom literature, right? About what good government is, how good government functions. And I'm not going to go into this because there's so much more in it, and I just don't have the time. Let's go back to Esther chapter 1. Turn to Esther chapter 1. What page is that? What page is Esther chapter 1? 1457. 1457, that's great, right? And let's go to the verse 10. Verse 10.
On the seventh day, when the king was merry with wine, he ordered Mehuman, Besetha, Harbona, Migtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcas, the 7 eunuchs in attendance on King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing a royal diadem, to display her beauty to the peoples and the officials, for she was a beautiful woman. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs. The king was greatly incensed, and his fury burned within him.
The king was greatly incensed, v'hamato ba'aravo, and his fury burnt within him. His anger, his wrath burned within him. What did we read in Proverbs? What is anger? It's a messenger of death, right? The anger of the king is a messenger of death. What happened to the king? His fury burned within him, right? It's a sign, right? Is this a sign of good government? Is this a sign of solid government? No. It's a warning sign, right? Now go to chapter 2, verse 1, the very beginning of chapter 2. Right? What happens? The king says, with regard to Queen Vashti, she needs to be sent away and all the rest of it. There's all of these advisors come to the king and all. It's all done in chapter 2, the very beginning of chapter 2. What happens?
Sometime afterward, when the anger of King Ahasuerus subsided, he thought of Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty. Let your majesty appoint officers in every province of your realm to assemble all the beautiful young virgins at the fortress Shushan in the harem under the supervision of Hagi, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women. Let them be provided with their cosmetics, and let the maidens who pleases your majesty be queen instead of Vashti." The proposal pleased the king, and he acted upon it.
And he acted upon it, right? When did he act upon a proposal that was actually a constructive proposal, that was about moving forward, about doing something that was positive, not destroying something that had been, but actually somehow moving, right? When his anger subsided. Hamat HaMelech Shachecha, right? When his anger subsided, right? The king got very angry in chapter 1. The very beginning of chapter 2, the very beginning of the first verse of chapter 2, the king's anger subsided, right? What happens in verse 7 of chapter 7 of the Scroll of Esther? What happens there? Chapter 7 of the Scroll of Esther, verse 7, what happens there?
The king in his fury left the wine feast for the palace garden, while Haman remained to plead with Queen Esther.
The king
for his
in
life.
his fury. The king was furious. The king yet again was angered. Anger, right? Look at what is happening here. Chapter 1, Vashti refuses to do the king's bidding, right? She undermines the king in front of all of his ministers, in front of everybody, right? And what is the response of the king? Anger and destruction. Following that anger, until the anger subsides. Now, Haman is seen to be undermining the king, as we have just seen, right? Haman is now at the queen's chambers, pleading for himself, for his life, and Ahasuerus goes out into the garden in his fury, in his anger, right? Chapter 7, verse 7. Now what happens in verse 10? Verse 10 of the same chapter.
7:10 is,
Yes.
so they impaled Haman on the stake which he had put up for Mordecai, and the king's fury abated.
The king's fury abated. Do we see a pattern? You remember that? Chapter 1 and chapter 2, the king was furious, the fury abated. Chapter 7, right? The king was furious, the fury abated. Do you see this? Yes? Something happened, Vashti was removed, the fury was abated. Haman was impaled, the fury was abated. Right? Yes? In other words, this is not just a text about politics and constitutional government, right? And the king's interest and the Jewish problem. Right? It's not just a text about religion and politics, as Margie rightly pointed out. But it is a text about temper and temperament and politics, right? And anger and the subsiding of the anger of the king. But, and here I'm going to leave you with one final thought, it is also a text, and at the end of the day a text, about the Jewish issue, here in the Persian context, the contrived or the made-up Persian context, right? There's no evidence of any of this happening in Persia at any time. Though the Greek version of the Scroll of Esther calls the king, Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes, who was an emperor. But we have no evidence of this. Now let's move forward and let's talk about the solution to the problem. Remember, Haman sent out an edict saying that on a particular day, on Passover, the Jews could be attacked, their property could be seized, and that they needed to be killed. And called upon Persians, other citizens of Persia, of the various nations, to go about and arm themselves and help themselves to those Jews. Right? Remember that? Yes? Now the question is, what do we do next? How do we resolve this issue? Right? Which turns us to chapter 8. Go to chapter 8 of the Scroll of Esther. And let's take a look at what happens in chapter 8, verse 11. What page are we on?
1466.
1466. Page 1466.
To this effect, the king has permitted the Jews of every city to assemble and fight for their lives. If any people or province attacks them, they may destroy, massacre, and exterminate its armed force together, with women and children, and plunder their possessions, on a single day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar.
Right? Okay. Now, what do we have here, right? The edict is promulgated for the month of Adar, right? The middle of the month of Adar. And what are the Jews allowed to do here? What are they allowed to do? They're allowed to fight for their lives, right? They're allowed to fight back. What is the prescription of the Scroll of Esther for the Jews in terms of resolving their issues, the issue of the hatred of Jews in the non-Jewish countries wherein they live? What is the solution? Defend ourselves, right? Defend ourselves, arm ourselves. Do not allow yourselves to be unarmed. Make sure that you are armed. Make sure that you are capable of defending yourselves, because the only way to resolve these kinds of issues will not be to just rely on government. You don't know which way government is going to turn. The Jews now need to be armed. They need to arm themselves and take care of defending themselves. If you're not armed, you cannot defend yourself. Right? In other words, if other people are going to be armed and are going to attack you, right? Now, for a moment, let's not talk about the Holocaust. Let's talk about Kristallnacht, as a precursor, right? Imagine Greenspan, kills a German diplomat in Paris. The Jews as a collective are blamed. And the government says to everybody, the Nazi government says to everybody, go out and attack Jewish institutions, synagogues, businesses, and so on and so forth. And yes, it's led by the government, but it's not just the government. I mean, people come out to attack synagogues and so on. I mean, people come out, right? What if the Jews were armed? What if they had their own militia? Right? Remember, every non-Jewish government, from the time this is written, is reading this. right? And what's the last thing they want? Armed Jews, right? But what is the solution of Queen Esther to this? The other people are coming for us and they're armed. We have to be able to arm and to defend ourselves, right? Look at the solution here, right? Turn to chapter 9. Chapter 9, verses 5. Let's start with verse 5. What does it say?
So the Jews struck at their enemies with the sword, slaying and destroying. They wreaked their will upon their enemies.
Yeah, let's continue.
In the fortress Shushan, the Jews killed a total of 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Ariasha, Aradai, and Vaizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamadatha, the foe of the Jews. But they did not lay hands on the spoil.
Right. Okay. What do the Jews do? They do as they're allowed to do, right? And in Shushan alone, 500 people are killed, right? Including the descendants of Haman, who are killed, right? Good enough, right? Good enough? No. Not good enough. Why? What happens next? Right? Go to verse 9. What happens next?
I read 9. Should I?
So go to 13, I'm sorry.
If it please your majesty, Esther replied, let the Jews in Shushan be permitted to act tomorrow also as they did today, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on the stake. The king ordered that this should be done, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan.
Okay,
Haman's
so
10 sons were
one day
impaled.
wasn't enough, right? One day wasn't enough. What did we need to do? We needed another day, right? Now read on and see what the implications are of the other day.
The king ordered that this should be done, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan. Haman's 10 sons were impaled, and the Jews in Shushan mustered again on the 14th day of Adar and slew 300 men in Shushan, but they did not lay hands on the spoil.
So now on the second day, there was yet again a Jewish attack now on the foes of the Jews, right? On the enemies of the Jews, yes? And suddenly, not an additional number of hundreds of people in Shushan alone were killed. And beyond that,
The rest of the Jews, those in the king's provinces, likewise mustered and fought for their lives. They disposed of their enemies, killing 75,000 of their foes, but they did not lay hands on the spoil.
so
That was on the 13th day of the month of Adar.
right. So the 14th day, the second day, that occurred on the second day, right? So on the second day, the other Jews in the other provinces also fought for their lives and killed 75,000 additional people. What is the statement, what is the message that is sent to us, the Jews, reading the Scroll of Esther with regard to Purim? What is the statement that is being made to us? First of all, we have a right and we have an obligation to defend ourselves, right? And we must act in the context of government to allow ourselves to be armed and to be able to defend ourselves, right? In other words, that's really the solution. The solution in the face of this is self-defense, right? Yes? Empowerment and self-defense. But what else is the solution according to the Scroll of Esther?
It's okay to overdo it.
It's okay to overdo it is nice, right? It's okay to go out and to kill these people. Well, that's right. They didn't take the spoils. They didn't take the property, right? Which was what the others had intended to do to the Jews, right? They had intended to take their property. The Jews did not take the property, But why did the Jews go out and kill their neighbors? Because their neighbors were going to kill them, and because there is, in this view of the world, no reconciling with this form of anti-Judaism. We have come to a place of zero sum. It's us or them. There comes a point in this view, in this particular author's view, wherein we can no longer negotiate. There are certain things in the context of which we come to wherein our reality is no longer negotiable. We're either defeated or we're victorious. Right? And by the way, that's the story of Passover too. There is no longer a negotiation with Egypt. We're done negotiating. Right?
So how did we let down our guard?
I'm sorry?
How did we let down our guard to have it happen again and again and again?
What was the promise of the emancipation? What was the promise of the enlightenment? Helga, you're asking, how did we let down our guard? What was the promise of the emancipation? What was the promise of the enlightenment? What was the promise of the West, the Western world to the Jews? Become citizens. You will be citizens like everybody else. You don't need this. You don't need to arm yourselves. You don't need to. You're citizens. The state will protect you. Right? The Jews had not been citizens of Germany, right? Until the 1860s.
But even then the state didn't protect them.
But even then the state didn't protect them. Even then the state did not protect them during the time of the Holocaust, right? Under the Nazi regime. The state failed the Jews, which corroborates, for a moment, the worldview of the redactor of the Esther Scroll, who says there comes a point where, right? And at the same time, it is so deeply troubling. It is so deeply problematic. Right? We are going to live among our neighbors and arm ourselves with the view that they're going to turn against us and try to kill us. This is how we're going to live our lives? This is what it's going to be about? Think about the implications of this. Think about the darkness of this vision of our Jewish existence in the world. This is what we're about. But isn't it realistic, on the one hand, and do we not have historical precedent for this happening in the 20th century, right? On the other hand, right? And at the same time, is this how we want to live our lives?
We can't afford to be complacent either.
And can we afford to be complacent, right? Yes?
But doesn't, in the Torah, doesn't God make promises about how we'll live as people will always be a people within Israel or something? I can't remember the
Right. Do we not have God's promises in the Torah, right? Yes, about being able to live and being able to be on the land and live in peace and security and so on and so forth, especially in the book of Deuteronomy. In a number of places in the book of Deuteronomy. The answer is yes. Are we living on the land? At the time of the exile, at the time of the diaspora, are we living on the land? Are we living as a sovereign nation? Are we living in peace? No, this is not the case, right? Now, and here is our introduction to the Scroll of Esther, you understand the complexity of the scroll. And what is the complexity of the scroll, and how are we going to summarize it? How do we tie these loose ends together? The scroll represents to us the struggle between what is a dark Jewish realism and the promise that we want to live by in the context of an integrated life, of the prophetic view of the promise that we bring to other people on the basis of collaboration and partnership and appreciation and citizenship and equality and improvement and progress in our lives, wherever we may be around the world. The Scroll of Esther brings all of this to light. When does this happen? When does it happen that the Jews turn against their enemies and kill them? When does this happen? When Mordechai himself is already second in command, is deputy to the king Ahasuerus, and has taken the place of Haman. What happens at the very conclusion of the Scroll of Esther? Look at the last verses of the Scroll of Esther on page 10, chapter 10. Turn to chapter 10 and take a look at the very last verses of the Scroll of Esther. Right? What does it say? What does it say?
King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the mainland and the islands, all his mighty and powerful acts, and a full account of the greatness to which the king advanced Mordecai, are recorded in the annals of the kings of Media and Persia. For Mordecai the Jew ranked next to King Ahasuerus and was highly regarded by the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brethren. He sought the good of his people and interceded for the welfare of all his kindred.
Did Ahasuerus succeed? Yes. Was Ahasuerus a great king? Yes. Did Ahasuerus receive tax and tribute from the mainland and from the islands? Yes. Did things go well for Ahasuerus? Yes. And did Mordechai take care of the Jewish interest? Yes. Did these things coincide? Yes. Is that possible? Yes. That's also in the Scroll of Esther. Now you understand the challenge of the Scroll of Esther. This is our introduction to the Scroll of Esther. Isn't this extraordinary? It is just a remarkable text. Yes? So this is the text we're going to start studying for the next couple of sessions over this period of Pesach. Right? Okay, Margie.
I don't want to sound irreverent, but it feels like a fantasy. The killings, even the wonderful ending of Ahasuerus being so great. I mean, it does feel sort of like a text that's partly a Jewish fantasy of success.
So Margie's saying this reads the remarks about the killing of the enemies of the Jews and all the rest of it, and the end of the Scroll of Esther reads a little bit like a fairy tale. It reads like a fantasy, right? It reads, I'm going to use words that you did not use, Margie, but there's something of a triumphalist feel to this, right? But that's what the text presents to us. And the text is a political text. And it presents a particular image and a particular view of what can happen and what needs to happen. Right? I mean, Haman sends out this edict and the genie is out of the bottle. And people are preparing to kill these Jews and to despoil them. Right? And something needs to happen. Or not happen. And what is that? And at the end of the day, did the story of Esther really happen in Persia? No. But what are we left with? The text. We're left with a story. That cautionary tale. We're left with that story. Right? So we have to take these words seriously. To us, they present a model. Now you see, right? We normally celebrate the story of Purim as a pediatric story. It's a children's story. And the children come and they dress up and we eat ham and tasha, and it's a fun children's story. But in reality, it's an adult story. It's an adult text. And it raises for us adult questions. And sadly, these questions persist in 21st century America. These are the questions we struggle with. And when we talk about temple security, and when we talk about the things that we need to do, and about the way we need to be alert, and about the trainings, and about everything else that's going on here, we do so for a reason. And the Scroll of Esther brings this to life for us. So thank you for joining us from home, and thank you for joining us here, and we'll continue next week. Yes.